C.S. Lewis has been called one of the most creative minds of the 20th century. More than 40 years after his death, Lewis's scholarly works are still used in university classrooms, while his children's books, The Chronicles of Narnia, are loved by families around the world. Books such as Mere Christianity and The Problem of Pain have been life-changing for multiplied thousands who consider Lewis a spiritual mentor and guide. But just who was C.S. Lewis? What events shaped his life? And how did he change from an outspoken opponent of Christianity to one of its most powerful defenders? Join us for The Making of a Mind, the life of C.S. Lewis, on this day of discovery.
Perhaps it was the land that first kindled the imagination of a boy. A boy who would one day become a writer of stories about an enchanted land. A land where courageous children confront evil and prevail through the power of a great lion and the deepest magic of all. Perhaps it all began with the land.
The geography and the landscape of Ireland are intimately linked in Lewis's imagination. He comes back to them again and again. The geography of Ireland and of Ulster in particular is very intimate. The hills are manageable. The scenery is full of, everywhere you look, there's practically some sort of link to a mythological event.
He particularly loved the area in the Mourne Mountains, which we've already talked about, and the area around Donegal with the wildness and the vast expanse of sky and sea and sand. And he also loved the north coast.
Clive Staples Lewis entered this world in Belfast, Northern Ireland, on November the 29th, 1898. He and his brother Warren, who was 3 years older, were born into a family that loved books and ideas. Their father Albert, a solicitor, read books voraciously, and the house overflowed with volumes ranging from Paradise Lost to E. Nesbit's children's fantasies. The boy's mother, Flora, held a degree in mathematics from Queen's University Belfast, an unusual attainment for a woman of her time.
Women were only really starting to go to university and being educated then. It wasn't an everyday thing. Now everybody goes to university, but degrees aren't worth an awful lot. I mean, those days, for her to have gone to university and get a degree, that was quite an achievement.
While Albert devoted himself to his work as an attorney, Flora cared for her 2 sons, supervised the servants, and took part in the community life of upper middle-class society. Every Sunday, the family attended St. Mark's Church of Ireland, where Flora's father, the Reverend Thomas Hamilton, had been the first rector.
It obviously had a big influence on his early upbringing, Christian life. It was a grounding on his religious upbringing.
Early on, it was evident that C.S. Lewis had a mind of his own. At the age of 4, he announced that he did not like the name Clive and wanted to be known as Jacksy. From then on, his family and friends called him Jacks, or simply Jack.
They had a very contented childhood. The family moved originally from Dundela Villas when they were both young to the bigger house at Little Lee, which that would be situated in East Belfast. And the move to the big house was a definite move also up in the social hierarchy. This was seen as an advancement. You were moving from the suburbs to a more affluent area, and this class-conscious considerations mattered in Belfast as they do elsewhere. This was a great growing city. You had the shipyards dominating the Belfast skyline, Harland and Wolff, where the Titanic was built, of course, everyone would be aware of that. Basically a thriving industrial centre at the turn of the century. Lewis describes the lying in bed and listening to the clang and hammer of the shipyard. So it's that busy port, thriving, and the noise and the clatter and the bustle, and very prosperous, very a city on the move, as it were.
We had a photograph, very poor photograph, of the Titanic going down the loch on our first voyage. You could certainly hear the shipyards working. And even I can remember that. And wartime years, that tap, tap, tap of the riveters. From little Lee, certainly they'd have heard the riveting sounds from the shipyard. I mean, Jack had said that in one of his books. Yes, they would have seen the loch too, through the trees, from upstairs.
But you go away from Little Lee, round a few corners, and up an area called Craigantlett, right into the Hollywood Hills. And he, with his brother Warnie, used to take his bicycle and head up into these hills and cycle up in the summertime on holidays, just looking around as guys do, young boys do. And when you go up there, and he describes it in Surprised by Joy, you have a tremendous vista of Northern Ireland. There's a place you can be up there, overlooking Hollywood and overlooking East Belfast, where you can see up north, up to the Antrim Hills, the Antrim Plateau, and you can see south right down to the mountains of Mourne and that area. That sort of romantic sense of longing, that sense of feeling for joy, that sense of looking beyond, was starting even when he was really a young child. And there are those who say, and I think they're right, that the geography or the topography of Northern Ireland is part of the geography of Narnia.
As young boys, Jack and Warnie drew pictures and wrote stories about their own imaginary worlds. Warnie called his India, while Jack created Animal Land. Eventually they merged them into the make-believe world of Boxen. When Warnie went away to boarding school, Jack missed his brother, but enjoyed the solitude of his space in the attic called the Little End Room. Then the boys would be together again for the school holidays and a month at the sea in Castle Rock with their mother.
Albert Lewis, of course, was a Belfast solicitor. Very, very busy schedule, ran his own office in the centre of Belfast. And he viewed these visits to the seaside as a sort of penitential, something that he had to do for the sake of the family. And Albert Lewis was the breadwinner of the family, and that's how he viewed it, this whole Protestant work ethic, which was how Belfast was built at that time and how it was part of his mindset. The idea of taking a month off to lounge about on a beach was just totally alien to him. He couldn't consider it. Plus, he was the police court solicitor, so he had work there that had to be carried out, and he was reluctant to hand that over to anyone else.
But everything changed for the Lewis family when Flora became seriously ill. Little Lee became like a hospital, with doctors and nurses speaking in hushed tones, and Albert often in tears. Flora suffered through 2 operations for cancer, was better for a time, then died in great pain on August 23, 1908. Warnie was 12 and Jack was 9.
Of course, with the death of Lewis's mother, things changed, attitudes changed, and well, Jack's life changed then, because he was, shortly after that, 2 weeks after his mother's death, he was sent away to boarding school in England. And I mean, it's hard to fathom now the effect that had on him.
Jack and Warnie crossed the Irish Sea by ferry on the first leg of their journey to the town of Watford, 30 miles northwest of London. Years later, C.S. Lewis wrote in his autobiography, "With my mother's death, all settled happiness, all that was tranquil and reliable, disappeared from my life. There was to be much fun, many pleasures, many stabs of joy, but no more of the old security. It was sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis.
I think when Flora Lewis died, the boys not only lost their mother, they lost the father, in the sense that Albert couldn't cope on his own at that point. Hence the decision to send Jack to boarding school in England. Perhaps he thought that being close to Warnie would somehow be the best option at that point. Perhaps he thought he would make a man of him, as it were. I'm not sure, but the decision was certainly catastrophic to a boy at that age.
For the next 2 years, Jack endured the academic monotony and the harsh punishments of Wynyard School under its brutal headmaster, the Reverend Robert Capron. The boys nicknamed the headmaster Oldie, and his grown son who assisted him, Wee Wee. Few boys escaped the headmaster's cruelty, and all lived in fear of his cane. Warnie left Wynyard in 1909, and Jack escaped a year later when the school closed. Shortly afterward, the headmaster was declared insane. During school holidays, Jack and Warnie returned home to Belfast. While Albert was away at work, they entertained themselves by reading, walking, and talking as best friends. They also stole their father's cigarettes and smoked them secretly. One civilizing element for the boys was the hospitality and care of their relatives, the Hewitt family who lived at the estate of Glenmachan, near Little Lee. Jack was especially fond of their youngest daughters, Kay and Gundred, 10 years older than he.
My mother was born Gundred, or Gundrida really, Hewitt. Her mother and Lewis's mother, Flora, were cousins. She was about 6 foot tall, with rich red hair, elegant. If I quoted Jack Lewis, the most beautiful woman he ever saw, she certainly was very attractive, and her photographs in her early life are very lovely. At the time after Flora had died, my grandmother took over looking after him, and filling in the gap of a mother, which really meant that a lot of it was Mum and Kay. They weren't always awfully fond of him. I remember somebody visiting one time and saying, "Well, what did you think of him? How did you think of him?" She just came straight out, "Oh, he was a cheeky little brat." Cheeky little brat? How could anybody say that about Jack Lewis? But she said, "No, he's a cheeky little brat." He was, according to what she always told me, he was very bumptious, full of himself, and cheeky.
After beginning a term at Campbell College in Belfast, Jack became so ill that Albert brought his son home for rest and recuperation. Lewis savoured his 2-month reprieve from school by reading scores of books, mostly fantasy and fairy tales. From there he entered Sherbrooke Preparatory School in Malvern, England, just up the hill from Warnie, who was at Malvern College. At Sherbrooke, Jack found a solid educational setting with capable teachers. But while his academic skill increased, his childhood religious belief began to wane. Through his own intellectual doubts and the subtle influence of those around him, Lewis experienced what he called a loss of faith, virtue, and simplicity. Of that time, he said simply, "I ceased to be a Christian."
Lewis had grown up in a Christian home, but he still, he had turned away. He was relieved. He thought of God as the great interferer. He didn't want someone to tell him what to do, someone to order his life. He wanted freedom, and when he was able to convince himself that God didn't exist, there was just relief.
When Lewis first saw a copy of the book Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods, with its vivid illustrations, it rekindled his childhood search for what he called joy, the longing for something far beyond happiness or pleasure. Jack's new interest in Norse mythology led him to the sweeping music of Richard Wagner, which captivated him with a feeling of northernness, far distances, and a world of imagination. Arthur Greaves, a Belfast neighbour, shared Jack's interest in mythology. Their lifelong friendship and correspondence helped Jack through many dark and discouraging days. During these years, C.S. Lewis occupied two worlds. In one, he worked hard at his studies, excelling in Latin and English, while taking part in school activities. In the other, he escaped to a place of imagination and heroic tales. But part of the continuing reality he and Warnie shared was the strained relationship with their father.
Jack's relationship with his father was very tense. Having said that, Albert Lewis supported his son financially throughout his studies. And Lewis did appreciate that. And after his father had died, Lewis had said, I think it was to Owen Barfield, that one of these major regrets was that he didn't treat his father better. He resented his father in many ways. He resented the domineering aspects of his father and so on, but possibly behind that is Albert Lewis's decision to send his son away to boarding school at such a young age. I think the letters between father and son they maintain a certain standard of what is expected in that relationship. But if you look at Jack's letters to, for instance, Arthur Greaves or to his brother Warnie, I mean, they continually poke fun at Albert and can be quite malicious in many respects. I mean, they call him the potato bird and so on, and the OAB, which is their abbreviated term for the old air balloon.
In 1913, Jack won a classical scholarship to Malvern College. Warnie enjoyed his years at Malvern and called it a paradise, but Jack quickly became unhappy there. Although he loved the beauty of the school and admired his English teacher, C.S. Lewis couldn't stand the system that valued athletes over scholars and forced everyone to play sports. Lewis suffered from a deformity of his thumbs, clumsiness of the hands, as he called it. He couldn't throw a ball or swing a bat, and disliked taking part in games or being required to cheer for those who did. He was appalled at the practice known as fagging, that allowed upperclassmen to use the younger boys virtually as slaves, to perform menial tasks for them. Often Lewis was called to clean someone's boots during the only time he had for preparation before morning classes. Jack just wanted to read and study and learn. At Malvern College, the Grundy Library became his sanctuary, from sports and servitude. Once inside, he could relax, and his mind could roam free. After a year, Jack's father agreed that his younger son simply wasn't suited for any public school. Albert sent him to be privately tutored by his own former headmaster, William Kirkpatrick, affectionately known as the Great Knock. C.S. Lewis arrived at Kirkpatrick's home in Great Bookham, Surrey, in September 1914, a month after the outbreak of World War I. Warnie, already commissioned in the army, was awaiting orders to the Western Front in France.
I think we can never get to the bottom of just how much Lewis was influenced by Mr. Kirkpatrick, his tutor, who really taught Lewis to think. Lewis said that when he arrived in Great Bookham in Surrey to begin being tutored by Mr. Kirkpatrick for Oxford, he ventured an opinion about what Surrey looked like. And Mr. Kirkpatrick pointed out that as he'd never been in Surrey before, and he didn't know what it was like, he wasn't entitled to an opinion.
What Kirkpatrick did for him and to him was to subject him to rigorous criticism about logical processes, so that he was not able to claim any particular point without having to justify it by having a reason for it. And in a way, the Great Knock, as he was called, W.T. Kirkpatrick, was the one who strengthened the rationality of Lewis, because up to this point, of course, in the early Lewis, the young Lewis, he was fascinated by story, he was fascinated by myths, he wrote stories, he lived in the world of books and the imagination. He had this openness to culture, but Kirkpatrick gave it discipline and direction.
Each day began with a traditional Irish breakfast of bacon, eggs and soda bread prepared by Mrs. Kirkpatrick. Private study and sessions with a great knock followed. They began by reading the Iliad in Greek and ranged through other classics in Latin, Italian, and German. In a letter to Albert Lewis, William Kirkpatrick said of Jack, "I never had any pupil who could bear the strain as he can, and as time goes on he makes it more severe. I admire his perseverance, industry, and determination. As I told you, I have to insist on his stopping work at 11 p.m.
Kirkpatrick was very, very important in his development, although Kirkpatrick was someone he also had to recover from the faith point of view, because Kirkpatrick was a skeptic, an unbeliever. He had started out training for the Presbyterian ministry, but he effectively lost his faith. And although he didn't influence Lewis negatively by trying to deprive him of his faith, the kind of precepts intellectually and logically he would have given Lewis would have reinforced him in the faith that he had already lost.
Although Lewis had recently been confirmed at St. Mark's Church to please his father, he considered himself an atheist. He wrote to Arthur Greaves, "I believe in no religion. There is absolutely no proof for any of them. And from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best. All religions, that is, all mythologies, to give them their proper name, are merely man's own invention." Years later, Lewis would say, in reflection, "A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. There are traps everywhere." And Lewis was about to step in one, laid many years before by the Scottish preacher and writer George MacDonald.
C.S. Lewis first began to read George MacDonald when he was a teenager. He was, at that time, studying with Kirkpatrick, the man who had such a huge impact on him in so many ways. And Lewis was on a train platform and always was looking for books and found an Everyman's edition of Fantastes. Picked it up, and he said he had no idea what he was letting himself in for. He began to read, and he said it wasn't until years later he realized what attracted him. But he said it was this, it was the scent of holiness, just drifting throughout those books, blowing throughout them. And he was captivated, obviously, and he read and continued to read MacDonald, and this was before he'd become a Christian.
And he said that reading that book was like crossing a frontier. He said his imagination had been baptized by reading that book. The rest of me, he said, not unnaturally took a little bit longer.
And so from there, MacDonald, as well as other authors, began to have this touch on his heart that awakened him to the fact that God did exist, and that there was something very compelling and something beautiful, and what he'd always longed for was, in fact, what he was finding was God.
At the end of 1916, Jack was accepted into Oxford University. But having reached the age of military service, the war raging in Europe lay between him and the studies he longed to pursue. Lewis said of himself at this time, "Christianity was mainly associated for me with ugly architecture, ugly music, and bad poetry. But of course what mattered most of all was my deep-seated hatred of authority, my monstrous individualism, my lawlessness. No word in my vocabulary expressed deeper hatred than the word interference. But Christianity placed at the center what then seemed to me a transcendental interferer. There was no region, even in the innermost depths of one's soul, which one could surround with a barbed wire fence and guard with a notice, 'No admittance.' And that was what I wanted. Some area, however small, of which I could say to all other beings, 'This is my business, and mine only.'"
Lewis had his own struggles. They were very great. And we ought to remember, Lewis often pointed this out, he was not a man who just sort of drifted into Christianity when he was a young man and just sort of grew in it. Lewis had resisted the faith for many years. He thought he had decided the matters of the universe, and it was more or less settled. But God wouldn't leave him alone.
In 1916, C.S. Lewis did not consider himself a Christian and had no intention of becoming one. But this was only one chapter in his life, and much remained to be written. Within a decade, Lewis would meet a fellow professor named J.R.R. Tolkien. Their friendship and mutual encouragement would lead them to write, among other works, The Chronicles of Narnia and The Lord of the Rings. These lines from Tolkien, unwritten in 1916, would later seem almost prophetic of what lay ahead for 18-year-old C.S. Lewis and many others like him. All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken. A light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king.